Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're cutting straight to the insights of political and economic commentator Steve Le.
Yeah, from his YouTube channel, Steve Le.
Exactly. He's taking a look at the current U.S. political landscape under President Trump and, well, pinpointing areas where he finds himself both agreeing and disagreeing.
Agreeing with the direction, maybe, but not always the methods.
That's the core of it. Our goal here is to unpack these perspectives, zero in on his main arguments, and, grasp the nuances.
And what's interesting right off the bat is he's not positioning himself as neutral here.
No, not at all.
He's upfront about his general support for the overall direction of Trump's policies since late 2024.
Right, which makes his points of disagreement even more significant, perhaps.
Exactly. That context is key.
So our main source is the transcript from his YouTube video, Kinsak Trump, Hunung Kaklam Ti Sao.
Which translates roughly to Trump's policies, the right direction, but what about the methods?
Yeah, uploaded March 30th. And Len himself says this video is, well, it's his personal views, building on that support for the broad strokes, immigration, economy, spending cuts, trade.
But the focus today, he says, is on specific actions. The how, not just the what.
Exactly. So for you, the learner, this deep dive should give you a pretty concentrated understanding of one commentator's perspective on recent moves.
We'll look at the policies he backs and the actions he critiques.
Trying to give you that shortcut to being informed on these specific points, maybe catching some of Les' engaging style too.
Okay, let's jump in then. First point, domestic policy. Immigration and free speech.
Right.
Lonia says he supports the policy of deporting undocumented immigrants, especially those with criminal records,
Okay.
or those involved in disruptive pro-Israel-Palestine protests, he specifically mentions. Property damage, supporting designated terrorist groups.
That seems fairly straightforward, aligning with, security and public order arguments. But then he flags a major disagreement.
Yes. This is where it gets complex. He strongly disagrees with revoking the visa and then detaining and deporting a Turkish PhD student from Tufts University.
And the reason?
Because of an op-ed the student wrote a year earlier, critical of Israel. Link sees this as a dangerous overreach.
Punishing protected speech, basically.
That's his argument. It definitely raises that fundamental question about free speech limits, especially for foreign nationals here on visas.
Yeah, those visas have conditions, sure, but deporting someone for essentially a political opinion piece, that feels different.
Very sensitive territory.
And Link draws a really sharp contrast, doesn't he?
He does. He says, look, disruptive protests by foreign students, that's one thing. But writing political commentary, even if it's critical of the U.S. or allies.
That's legitimate free speech in his book.
Especially for academics. He even mentions his own past, writing critically about political systems.
So he's defending the principle, even for speech that might be unpopular or critical.
It's exactly. Academic freedom, the free exchange of ideas, he sees that as vital. His own background kind of lends weight to that.
He then points out a potential inconsistency, too.
Yeah, he notes that the overall deportation numbers under Trump so far aren't actually as high as under Biden or Obama.
Interesting.
But this specific case, the academic one, makes him worry about the reasons behind certain deportations. Is it about the speech?
And the potential chilling effect that could have on other foreign students or academics here?
Right. Makes you wonder if it was targeted because of the op-ed's content, rather than just routine immigration enforcement.
Especially given those overall deportation numbers you mentioned.
And he brings up Marco Rubio's comments on this case, too.
What did Rubio say?
Reportedly that the student was involved in anti-government activities and political protests. And La really questions the evidence for that, beyond just the published op-ed. Where's the proof of broader activities?
It really highlights the need for transparency and, well, due process. Serious claims need solid evidence.
Absolutely. And we should remember this case is ongoing. The student has lawyers.
Okay, so shifting gears slightly, but still on domestic policy, Lunn also criticizes the White House's communication style.
Yeah, specifically their social media. It's interesting given his general policy support.
He finds it lacking seriousness, sometimes insensitive.
What are the examples?
Well, one instance was the official White House channel reposting a Time magazine "Long Live the King" joke. Lunn just felt that was inappropriate.
Diminishing the dignity of the office, perhaps?
That seems to be his take. It touches on that symbolic role of the presidency, right? Even social media posts carry weight.
They can reflect the seriousness or lack thereof associated with the office.
Then he critiques another post, one using an anime-style image,
An anime image. For what?
to depict the deportation of a repeat fentanyl trafficker.
Wow. Okay.
And Len acknowledges, look, fentanyl trafficking is incredibly serious, but using a lighthearted meme format for a deportation?
He found that insensitive.
Yeah, insensitive to the human aspect involved. He makes the point that deportation isn't, a happy thing.
It's a complex, serious issue.
Right. He suggests they could have just stated the facts directly without the meme.
It's that challenge of communicating in the digital age while keeping empathy, especially on sensitive topics like immigration.
And Luen connects this back to the bigger picture of immigration policy. He says he wants a system that lets contributors enter legally.
Right, emphasizing the need for population and talent in the U.S.
So his critique of the meme isn't necessarily about opposing the deportation itself, but the communication style and maybe the broader message it sends about how immigrants are viewed.
Okay, let's pivot to foreign policy now.
Yeah.
Canada comes up first.
Yeah, the trade war. Len expresses, confusion about the ultimate goal there.
He's not alone in that. He points to the historically strong relationship, Canada being generally pro-U.S.
It makes sense. It's always been a close partnership.
He raises a really crucial economic point, too. Canada's reliance on the U.S. for energy infrastructure.
The oil and gas pipelines.
Yeah, all pipelines currently go through the U.S., even if the resource eventually goes back to Canada. It just shows how tangled our economies are, especially in energy.
So what about the trade deficit argument? That's usually the justification given.
Right. Well, it dives into those numbers. 2023 figures. Canada exported $440 billion to the U.S.
Okay.
The U.S. exported $348 billion to Canada. So on the surface, that looks like a roughly $100 billion deficit for the U.S.
Right. That's the number you often hear.
But here's List's key point. $128.5 billion of Canada's exports were crude oil, petroleum, other raw materials.
Okay. So essential inputs for the U.S. economy.
Exactly. And Lai argues if you subtract those raw material imports from Canada's total,
And the picture changes.
completely, he calculates the U.S. actually has a trade surplus with Canada, maybe around $30 billion or so.
30 billion surplus. Wow.
Yeah. He even suggests Canada probably sells those raw materials at a pretty good price to the U.S., a benefit.
So given that analysis, he's basically asking, why the trade war?
Precisely. If the U.S. is arguably already in a favorable position, when you look closer, what's the rationale for the tariffs and the tension? What problem are we solving?
That's a really sharp challenge to the official narrative.
It is. Then he quickly dismisses the idea of Canada becoming a U.S. state.
Why?
Practical politics. Canada's more liberal political leanings would likely cause issues for the Republicans. Plus, Canada's part of the Commonwealth. Territory status is unlikely.
Makes sense. Just not politically feasible on multiple levels.
But here's another twist Lovery brings up. The political impact in Canada itself.
How so?
He contends the trade war actually backfired politically there. Before the tensions ramped up, the ruling Liberal Party was struggling.
Okay.
And the Conservative Party, under Pierre Poilievre, seen as quite pro-Trump, looked like they were going to win the next election.
Interesting timing.
Liz's argument is that the trade war caused a backlash in Canadian public opinion. It might have actually helped the Liberals regain popularity.
So it potentially undermined the prospect of a more aligned government in Canada.
That's his suggestion. Maybe even prompting an early election call. An unintended consequence, potentially weakening the U.S. position.
He also flags the NATO spending issue, right?
Yeah, Canada consistently not meeting the 2% GDP target. They're around 1.54%, aiming for 2% by 2030.
A long-standing point of friction.
And Leben suggests maybe a better relationship, less tension, could have actually helped make progress on that front.
Instead of hindering it.
Possibly. Finally, on Canada, he just slams the unpredictability of the policies.
It's a tariffs on, tariffs off situation.
Exactly. Announced, delayed, maybe reinstated. He says it causes huge disruption for businesses. Uses the example of auto parts crossing the border multiple times.
Yeah, that uncertainty makes planning impossible for businesses. Bad for the economy on both sides.
Definitely.
Okay, next up, Greenland.
Here, Lunetz actually starts with agreement on the strategic interest.
Really? What aspects?
He cites the rare earth minerals there, super important for tech.
Right. EVs, phones, all that.
Also, the Arctic shipping routes opening up due to climate change, Greenland's location for deterring Russian missiles, and China's growing interest in the Arctic.
So strategically, Greenland is becoming much more important. Les sees that.
He does. But then, A sharp disagreement on the approach.
The how again.
Exactly. He thinks Trump's direct, pressured attempts to buy or take Greenland were totally counterproductive.
Too blunt.
Yeah, harmful even. Les suggests a completely different strategy. Much softer, much longer term.
What does he propose?
First, help Greenland gain independence from Denmark. Commit to matching Denmark's financial support about $500 million a year.
Okay, so foster independence first.
Build goodwill, build influence that way. Then leverage Greenland's tiny population, only 56,000 people.
How?
Through economic ties, gradual integration of U.S. citizens, maybe initially as dual citizens. Over time, Greenland might willingly choose to become a U.S. state or territory.
A much more patient game.
Very patient. He kind of draws a parallel to China's long-term population transfer strategies in its territories.
And he mentions the existing U.S. military presence.
Yeah, 1,000 to 1,500 U.S. personnel are already there. That's a significant chunk of the population already. It could be a base to build from.
But Trump's approach had the opposite effect.
That's what Lynn argues. He points to a recent poll showing 85% of Greenlanders now oppose joining the U.S.
85%? That's huge opposition.
Huge. Le blames Trump's public statements, the pressure, even reported threats of using the military. He thinks announcing the objective so openly was a mistake.
So it hardened opposition in Greenland and strained ties with Denmark?
And damaged alliances with Europe more broadly, Le believes. Made everyone defensive.
Yeah, okay, let's shift to Ukraine. Let's take here.
He thinks Trump's stance has been pretty consistent since he first ran for president. Skeptical about long-term, open-ended support.
He mentions that Oval Office meeting between Trump and Zelensky, too.
Yeah, he suggests that controversy really solidified Trump's views, created lasting friction, it seems.
And that impacts practical things, like deals.
Lowe thinks so. He points to a proposed mineral deal between the U.S. and Ukraine. Says it's changed significantly since the early stages, likely due to the strained relationship. Expects more tough negotiations.
It shows how diplomacy and personal ties can really affect outcomes.
Definitely. Then there's Zelensky's statement about not having to repay previous U.S. military aid.
Love finds that problematic.
Yeah, problematic for winning over American public support. He thinks many Americans probably assumed it wasn't all just outright gifts.
Transparency about aid is always crucial for maintaining support back home.
And speaking of money, Le clarifies the G7 loan program.
The $50 billion one?
That's the one. $20 billion from the U.S. It's intended to be repaid using interest from frozen Russian assets.
Okay, so Russia indirectly pays.
That's the idea. But Liu adds a crucial warning. If peace happens, those assets will likely be unfrozen and returned to Russia.
Leaving Ukraine on the hook for the loan.
Exactly. And he strongly advises against the U.S. or Europe just confiscating those Russian assets. He warns of severe damage to the credibility of the dollar, the euro, Western government bonds. A huge risk to the financial system.
That's a really important point about the potential consequences. A delicate balance.
Very delicate. Lent also touches on the stalled peace talks.
Yeah, what's the holdup there, according to him?
He points out that Zelensky himself signed a decree back in October 2022.
A decree about what?
Prohibiting negotiations with Putin personally. And that decree is still in effect.
Ah, so that's a significant political obstacle right there.
It seems so. Then Lutt addresses claims about France and the UK sending troops.
Zelensky said they were ready to?
Yeah, but Lutt calls that extremely misleading.
Why misleading?
He says while they discussed sending advisors or support staff, they never committed to sending actual combat troops without a U.S. security guarantee.
Meaning a promise the U.S. would protect them if Russia attacked them.
Exactly. Lest says they ultimately lacked the commitment without that U.S. backing, highlighting, the limits of European defense without the U.S. He cites the Wall Street Journal on this.
So a gap between rhetoric and reality.
That's what Liu suggests. He clarifies French President Macron was talking about maybe a working group or advisors, not combat forces going head-to-head with Russia.
Okay. Let's zoom out a bit now to U.S.-Europe relations more broadly.
Liu acknowledges things have definitely shifted. He suggests those shared values that underpin the alliance might be weakening.
A worrying trend. He mentions an anecdote about free speech in the UK.
Yeah, a concerning one, apparently. It fits this wider narrative of questioning the traditional transatlantic ties. Priorities might be diverging.
Does Le blame Trump's approach entirely?
Not entirely. He suggests relations could have been handled better, more smoothly perhaps, but he also gives Trump some credit.
Credit for what?
He reminds us of Trump's 2018 warning to Angela Merkel about Europe's energy dependence on Russia.
Ah, yes, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline controversy.
Right. Trump warned him, got mocked at the time, but Liz says he was ultimately proven right, identified a real vulnerability.
So a mixed assessment there. But then La flags a specific area of disagreement with Trump's handling of Europe.
Yes, alienating traditionally strong allies, particularly Poland.
Poland. They've been very pro-U.S., haven't they?
Extremely. LaFlying emphasizes their strong pro-American stance. Their high defense spending projected 4.7% of GDP in 2025, consistently way above the 2% NATO target.
4.7%. That's massive.
It is. And Poland historically wanted a permanent U.S. military base, even offered to pay for it. Remember Fort Trump?
I do remember that. So a very committed ally.
Very. But Lavoie recounts an incident where Polish President Duda was apparently kept waiting for an hour and a half before a meeting with Trump.
Ouch, that sounds disrespectful.
Lavoie presents it that way. And contrasts it with the warm relationship Trump has with other leaders, like Italy's Meloni, who don't meet the NATO spending targets but are perhaps more politically aligned.
So it looks like personal rapport sometimes overrides shared strategic commitments.
That's the implication Liz draws. He argues this approach has genuinely damaged the U.S.-Poland relationship, eroded trust. He points to a visit by the new U.S. Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, to Poland. Austin's comments were apparently seen as non-committal, shaking Poland's confidence in U.S. security guarantees.
Especially given Poland's history, like the betrayals in WWII Le mentioned. Trust is paramount.
Exactly. Le believes alienating allies like Poland weakens the U.S. position overall, makes it harder to build a unified European front aligned with U.S. interests.
Okay, let's bring it back home. Domestic policy again, the pardon of Trevor Milton.
Right, the founder of Nikola, the electric truck company.
Yeah.
Laraz strongly disagrees with this pardon.
Right, the strong disagreement.
He acknowledges the huge financial losses people suffered, including Vietnamese investors, due to Nikola's alleged deception.
Yeah, that case involves serious fraud allegations. Milton was convicted.
And that's Liz's point. Milton was convicted, sentenced to 4 years. While some might say other CEOs do similar things and don't get prosecuted.
Lay argues the conviction makes the pardon inappropriate.
Yes. A conviction should mean something, he believes. Pardoning him now raises serious questions.
And there were political connections mentioned.
There were. Le notes Milton made a big donation, $1.8 million, to a Trump PAC.
Okay.
And Milton's lawyer is the brother of Florida Attorney General Ashley Moody, used to be Pam Bondi.
And Bondi reportedly advocated for the pardon.
That's what LaRue reports. He also mentions Trump apparently claimed he didn't know Milton personally, but was told the case was unfair because Milton supported him.
An explanation Levine's unconvincing.
Deeply unconvincing, given the conviction. He views pardons as very serious business, especially after controversial ones under Biden, too. He's clearly worried about the optics here.
Understood. What about the JFK files? Any bombshells there?
According to Lizzie, no. Disappointment seems to be the main reaction. He acknowledges it's tough to find definitive answers so long after the event.
Yeah, the trail gets colder over time. Still a topic of fascination, though.
For sure. Ludilis also reiterates his view on the Epstein files.
What's his stance?
He doesn't believe Trump is implicated. Says Democrats tried hard to find a link during Trump's presidency but came up empty.
He thinks the files likely involve many other prominent people.
That's his take. A common view among Trump supporters, seeing the focus on Trump as politically driven.
And the Durham report?
Similar story, really. Lowe expresses some disappointment about the lack of major developments or outcomes from that investigation into the Russia probe's origins.
Another highly anticipated report that didn't quite deliver the knockout blow some expected.
Seems that way, from Lowe's perspective.
Okay, what about RFK Jr.'s role in the administration?
Le Mélenchon's initial enthusiasm for RFK Jr.'s Make America Healthy Again initiative.
Kaput.
But he notes a lack of significant policy changes so far. Acknowledges Kennedy's only been in the role about 6 weeks, though.
So, maybe too early to judge?
Probably. Lowe does mention the debate about restricting food stamps, SNMAP, for unhealthy things like soda.
Ah, the soda ban debate.
Right. Lerner sees the pace on that as slow, kind of highlighting how complex these issues are and how slowly government can move. A bit disappointed, but realistic about government speed.
Fair enough. Now, the dismissal of inspectors general, that caused a stir early on.
It did. Acknowledges Trump dismissed a lot of them, reportedly 27 early in his term, raised concerns about oversight independence.
But Leneff puts it in context.
He does. He points out it's not unprecedented. President Obama also dismissed some IGs appointed by George W. Bush. Fewer, yes, but it happened.
And Republicans protested back then.
They did. So, Leness, the president, does have the authority to dismiss IGs. They just need to state a cause.
What was Obama's stated cause?
A lack of trust in their ability to do their jobs. Lapines that rationale pretty comparable to reasons Trump might have used.
So he doesn't fully agree or disagree?
Kind of sits on the fence, given the precedent and the president's authority, acknowledges the authority, recognizes the potential for politics. A nuanced take.
Okay. What about government spending, specifically the Department of Defense? Does Lannes disagree with Trump there?
Actually, it's the opposite. Lear thinks the current administration, under this figure he calls Elon, unclear exactly who that is in this context, maybe a placeholder or a specific official.
Right, someone in authority.
Lear thinks they haven't gone far enough in cutting DoD spending.
Interesting. Usually Republicans want more defense spending.
It is an interesting take. He also flags Social Security.
Untouchable, usually.
Right. Trump pledged not to cut it. But Lear says it's a major area needing reform to fix budget deficits down the line.
The trust fund's running out in the 2030s.
That's the projection he mentions. He sees changes as essential long-term, even if politically difficult now. A fiscal reality check.
Finally, Signalgate, the leaked messages, controversy.
Yeah, Lears maintains his view that, while serious, it's not as significant as some other leaks we've seen under Biden or even previous administrations.
Like what?
He cites leaks of Israeli war plans, the capture of an Iranian sky in the Pentagon, things he sees as more damaging national security breaches.
So perspective is important.
He thinks so. He views Signalgate more as a mistake, maybe poor judgment, rather than some deliberate policy issue.
Could have been handled better?
Definitely. He suggests a quick, direct apology could have nipped the controversy in the bud.
And he has advice for the Democrats.
He does. He cautions them against pushing too hard for the resignation of my war. Seems to be a key advisor involved. Jeffrey Goober, too, apparently.
Well, I caution them.
Because Lego argues this my war individual is actually the most pro-NATO, pro-EU, pro-Ukraine figure in Trump's inner circle.
So removing them could backfire on those policy fronts.
That's Lay's strategic calculation. Removing that person might actually harm the very causes some Democrats support.
Interesting political maneuvering there. Before we wrap up, Lay comments on his own perceived bias.
He does. He addresses the idea that he's pro-Trump. Says flat out he doesn't feel obligated to be neutral.
He'll just state his opinions, right or wrong.
Yeah. He thinks his audience prefers that honest perspective over some kind of forced neutrality. Acknowledges the topics are sensitive, hopes people consider his views thoughtfully.
Refreshingly candid, perhaps.
Very transparent about his approach.
Okay, so let's summarize the key takeaways for you, the learner. We've gone through Steve Lee's detailed look at recent Trump administration actions. We've seen where he agrees and where he has significant disagreements.
Key areas of concern for Leah included that free speech issue with the Turkish student, the White House communication tone, the whole Canada trade war rationale and impact.
Right, the Greenland acquisition strategy, aspects of Ukraine policy, and how key allies like Poland have been treated.
And domestically. The Trevor Milton part and the sort of non-events with the J.F. Epstein files and Durham report, RFK Jr.'s initial steps, the IG dismissals.
And his views on government spending and Signalgate, quite a range.
Definitely. And some surprising nuggets emerged. That potential U.S. trade surplus with Canada, if you exclude raw materials, was fascinating.
Yeah, and the details about Poland's strong pro-U.S. stance and then their subsequent disappointment. Also the nuances of those troop deployment discussions regarding Ukraine, things you might not get from headlines.
Absolutely.
So understanding these different viewpoints really helps appreciate the complexities, doesn't it? The diverse reactions to policies.
Encourages you to think more deeply about the potential consequences, both at home and internationally.
Right. Which leads us to a final thought for you to ponder.
Consider Les' argument about Greenland. That maybe a long-term, patient strategy of fostering independence would have been smarter than the direct attempt to buy or take it.
How often do you think those immediate, forceful approaches in international relations overshadow the more subtle, long-game strategies?
And what are the potential long-term costs and maybe benefits of each approach? Something to think about.